was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was a top man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a blowin' reveille. He's the boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B.
Welcome to the 1940s decade overview. Your facts to get us started here are right there for you. Notice the unemployment rate in the 1940s is back down to a more reasonable level. We're increasing in life expectancy and salaries. A new one here for you is that minimum wage it now exists as a result of FDR's policies in the late 1930s. 43 cents an hour, of course, doesn't seem like a whole lot to you and I, but if we were to translate that into current money, that's probably around $5 an hour. And so having a minimum wage job in the 40s was actually a pretty decent gig. Auto deaths, you'll see there at the bottom. I put that there because in the 40s we don't have a lot of safety regulations concerning designs of cars and highway rules and regulations, but we'll see that kind of stuff coming up here in the 50s and 60s. And gas, 18 cents a gallon. Don't you wish it was that now? All right, so what's happening in the 1940s that's impacting everyday American lives? Isolationism is no longer with the December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese military. We have about 2,400 American casualties as a result of Pearl Harbor, and the very next day, FDR declares war on Japan. It shocked Americans that this attack happened on our own soil, but it wasn't a huge surprise to the military, and that even though we'd been neutral on paper concerning the events going on in Europe and in the Pacific, we'd still been helping countries in the South Pacific and in Asia fight off Japanese colonialism for about a decade at this point. So the government had a plan for what to do if we needed to engage with the Japanese in war. But Americans were totally shocked that it happened. The average American was surprised. Germany, Italy, as a result of this, will then declare a war on us once we declare war on Japan, and congrats, Americans are now involved in World War II. As a result of Americans being involved in World War II, you're going to see in the 40s an increase of women leaving the home and entering the workforce. Just to kind of give you an indication as to why that happened, we had 16.1 million Americans serve in the military between 1941 and 1946. And of those 16.1 million people, 73% of them were serving abroad for an average of about 2.5 to 3 years. And so when you have all of those people involved in the military, 10 million of those that were drafted, there's nobody left at home to work in the factories to make the supplies needed to fight the war. And so then women working in factories and doing the jobs that normally would have been reserved for men. This kind of opens the door for women leaving the home, from this point in history until the present. As a result of being involved with the World War, we had at home a lot of things that were rationed, which just meant that the government prohibited average Americans from stockpiling certain things that were deemed necessary for the war effort. And so Americans had little books of stamps that you actually had to use to buy certain things, like milk, other foods, fuel, fabric, and even cars, in that some of those supplies were supposed to be reserved for fighting the war effort. And so you had to ration those things out. One of the examples that happens as a result of rations are victory gardens. So you can see one of the little War Garden Commission's posters over there on the right. I absolutely adore that tiny carrot with an American flag. But look at that. the seeds of victory ensure the fruits of peace. So planting your own gardens and canning your own food so that you're not buying up the food at the grocery store that could be feeding your soldier abroad. And so Americans, even those not drafted, everybody really felt like they were part of, fighting that war and helping out the military. A not so pretty element of the 1940s in American history is the fact that Japanese internment camps existed. Internment, I guess, being our fancy way of trying to hide the fact that we had prison camps in the United States. Look, at the time, there was absolute hysteria about being attacked again. And so, unfortunately, Americans of Japanese descent, as a result of an executive order signed by FDR, were gathered up, and between 1942 and 45, were forced to leave their homes and live in these prison camps. It affected about 120,000 people, 2/3 of those that were American citizens, and half of those being children. And so, on one hand, we can understand the hysteria and being, afraid of Japanese spies. But in hindsight, it seems a bit extreme to take away, American citizens' freedom as a result of being, afraid of spies. And in hindsight, it was a horrible decision, not just because you're taking away people's freedom, but also because there were only 10 people ever convicted in the U.S. of being spies for Japan. And ironically enough, all 10 were Caucasian. None of them were Japanese. And so a lot of these Japanese Americans, once they were released, tried to return back to a house that they didn't even know if they still had anymore. And many of them actually returned back to Japan just as a result of not feeling comfortable living here anymore. The atomic bomb, obviously you remember from history class, is what ended World War II. Know that Germany had already surrendered. The war in Europe was over, but World War II was by no means winding down, in that the war in Asia and the South Pacific was still really heavy in fighting. As a matter of fact, of the 1.25 million U.S. casualties in World War II, 1 million of those happened between June of 44 and June of 45. And so the government was really trying to figure out, like, how do we end the war in the South Pacific and in Asia without losing so many more lives. And so the atomic bomb had been in development since the 1930s with the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer, who was a physicist in charge. And so the technology was there. The U.S. government gave Japan warnings to surrender to the terms of the surrender. Japan refused. And so in 1945, we have first the bombing of Hiroshima. There's a picture there of the plane, Tibbets flying the plane, the Enola Gay, which is going to drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Japan's given a chance to surrender after that. They refuse, and so a few days later, the second atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. Why those two cities? They were both involved with military production for Japan. Nagasaki was a big trading port. Even though Nagasaki wasn't actually our first choice of cities, weather deemed their that second official target to not be a good one, so they actually went with Nagasaki as a second choice. But horrible devastation, hundreds of thousands of lives lost instantly, and the effects of cancer as a result of radiation poisoning are seen for decades after that. And so are only two examples of nuclear bombs ever being used in history are what finally end World War II. Once World War II is over, we see what's called a baby boom, which is a huge increase in the birth rate. Everyone's happy that the war is over. Men and women are back on the home front together, and Well, lots of babies are born. And so the baby boomers is actually a name that we give to an entire generation of people that were born after World War through the early 60s, right, whose parents would have been involved in the fighting of World War II or on the home front during World War II. And so a baby boom usually signifies good economic growth, good times, stability. And so the period of time after World War II is actually very prosperous for Americans, as you will see in the next video on the 1950s. And so World War II obviously defining everything in the 1940s, and so those being the issues on your screen of the things that affected the everyday American. So thanks for listening.